In western Virginia's mountains, where centenarian pines frame dancing fog and time appears to have stopped around 1920, there is a place America chose to forget. A small, rural community in the Appalachians, Odd, has become synonymous with something modern society deems an absolute taboo: generations of marriages between direct relatives. The narrow, irregular dirt road leading to the Whitaker family's property is flanked by wooden houses challenging gravity's laws and rusty trailers. Kilometers before reaching the destination, the GPS ceases to operate. It's as though the technology itself refuses to acknowledge this place's existence. By 2020, documentary filmmaker and photographer Mark Leiter ventured into these mountains with one question haunting his mind: how can an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriages? What he found was a reality that defies all fiction. The Whitaker family isn't merely an isolated case of consanguinity. They represent the extreme consequence of generations of absolute poverty, geographical isolation, and traditions perpetuated for over a century. The physical and mental marks. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whitaker are siblings who carry in their minds and bodies the mental and physical marks of a genetic lineage that has closed upon itself. Ray, the eldest brother, has severe physical malformations. His head, a condition known as microcephaly, is disproportionately small relative to his body. He communicates only through gestures and grunts. His intellectual capacity is severely compromised. The only sister, Lorraine, has motor difficulties preventing her from walking normally and obvious facial deformities. Despite being able to utter some words, Timmy has a severe intellectual disability. His face bears the unmistakable signs of consanguinity, serious dental issues, facial asymmetry, and an empty gaze that reveals decades of social isolation. The youngest, Freddie, is the only one capable of holding basic conversations, but even he shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. What's most shocking isn't just the visible physical deformities but the naturalness with which this family accepts their condition. For them, this is the only reality they know. The house has no mirrors. There is no television showing other families. They have no outside world references that would let them understand how profoundly different they are. The house they inhabit is a heap of rooms lacking running water, electric light, or any modern comfort. Abandonment and the smell of mold permeate every corner. Piles of trash accumulated over years create mountains of debris in the backyard. It's impossible to discern where the garbage ends and where what they consider personal belongings begins. Check if you're already registered with this channel, because this is one of the most extreme and documented stories of consanguinity ever recorded in the United States, and you won't find details like this anywhere else. Roots of isolation and genetic drift. To understand how the Whitaker family reached this point, we must go back to the 19th century when the first settlers established themselves in western Virginia's isolated mountains. Extreme geographical isolation has always characterized the Appalachian region. In deep valleys, separated by kilometers of dense forest and insurmountable mountains, entire communities formed. The region's geography is brutal and merciless. Mountains abruptly rising over 1,200 meters in altitude create narrow, isolated valleys where, over generations, small communities develop their own traditions, language, and culture. Snowfall during the winter can completely isolate these communities for consecutive months, forcing families to rely exclusively on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that when small groups are geographically isolated for generations, the genetic pool becomes progressively more limited. What happened in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founding populations, Wells states in his research, published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 2018. Wells goes on to explain the concept of a population bottleneck. When a population is drastically reduced and remains isolated, it loses available genetic diversity, creating a vicious cycle that eventually leads to mandatory consanguinity. The Appalachians' documented history is replete with similar examples. Whole families migrated to remote valleys during the colonial era, seeking isolation and autonomy from the federal government. Many of these families brought ancient European traditions with them, including marriage practices already considered problematic at the time. The Whitaker family's roots are documented in the region since 1887, when John Whitaker and his wife, Sarah, settled in Odd. American census records indicate that marriages between first-degree cousins began in the second generation. Marriages between half-sisters and siblings became a common practice by the third generation, not by choice, but due to an absolute lack of options. Religious formalization of incest. The local Methodist Church's archives, preserved in Charleston's historic library, reveal disturbing details about the religious formalization of these unions. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community from 1920 to 1945, kept meticulous records of funerals, weddings, and baptisms. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing his growing concern about the irregular unions he was forced to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today, I performed the wedding of Mary Whittaker with her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 years old and already shows visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry isn't much better. Both are the children of a union between father and daughter. Divine blessing." These entries continue for years, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Morrison records at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives in the Whittaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his increasing anguish but also his sense of powerlessness against a tradition that was perpetuated regardless of his approval. Isolation wasn't just geographical, it was cultural, economic, and religious. The Whittaker family belongs to a fundamentalist religious sect that views the outer world as corrupt and sinful. Marrying outside the family was considered a betrayal of religious and family values, besides being geographically impractical. This sect, locally known as the Church of the Elected, developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal documents found on the Whittaker property include manuscript sermons that interpret biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the lineage's purity. The genetic consequence, extreme homozygosity. In the fourth generation, the genetic consequences began to surface. Medical records at Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 Whittaker family children were born with severe disabilities. 8 of them died before age 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in something geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which usually remain inactive when a person marries a genetically distant individual, become dominant when both parents carry the same genetic mutations. In the Whittaker case, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed that the current siblings have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.375. This means they are genetically closer than would be possible even among normal siblings born of the same parents. This indicates that their parents were themselves the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To contextualize this number, Dr. Bamshad explains, a consanguinity coefficient of 0.375 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we see in the Whittaker suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of very close relatives mating. This level of consanguinity leads to something geneticists call extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the Whittaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios in human genetics. Martinez continues, what we see in the Whittaker is essentially the human equivalent of a highly inbred laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that it's a miracle they survived to adulthood. Their bone structure, neurological development, immune system, and cardiac function were all compromised by this extreme genetic burden. Detailed genetic tests showed that the Whittaker siblings carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed simultaneously. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whittaker family represents a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. Physical malformations are just the tip of the iceberg. Chronic kidney problems, congenital heart issues, partial deafness, and an extremely compromised immune system are part of these siblings' daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy, with crises lasting hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that cause her to constantly wheeze, as if always out of breath. The most disturbing aspect is that these siblings are the survivors. Local church documents indicate that at least 7 other siblings were either stillborn or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. The 4 who survived are, paradoxically, the less severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have extinguished decades ago. Institutionalized incest and family dynamics. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whittaker family cannot be understood simply as an individual choice. It's the result of a complex system of ignorance, poverty, and isolation that has been self-perpetuated for over a century. Betty Whittaker, a distant cousin who managed to leave the community in the 1970s, offers a shocking account of how internal family dynamics worked. No one explained anything to anyone, she tells documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter in an interview. The girls got pregnant by their own brothers, uncles, or fathers, and that was considered normal. There was no knowledge about genetics. There was no sex education. There were no alternatives. Betty, now 73 and living in a Charleston retirement home, carries her own emotional and physical scars from life on the Whittaker property. She has minor deformities in her fingers and slight facial asymmetry, signs that she, too, is a product of consanguinity, though to a much lesser degree than her current cousins. I was considered the normal one in the family, Betty remembers bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple math, it gave me enough courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver hitchhiked me to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that demonstrate how incest was institutionalized within the family. There was a ceremony they called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl turned 14 years old. The patriarch of the family in my time, old Thomas Whittaker, chose which family man would be that girl's guardian. It didn't matter if it was her uncle, father, brother, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians had exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty says resisting this designation resulted in severe punishment, food deprivation, isolation in the dark basement, and, in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. My younger sister, Rebecca, tried to escape 3 times, Betty recalls with tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to ensure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at the age of 23, giving birth to her 5th son. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not only tolerated but encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to ensure family properties were not divided with strangers and to maintain the lineage purity. Old John always said that Whittaker blood was pure blood and that mixing with others was a sin, she recalls. Raleigh County Social Assistance records, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whittaker children were recorded with the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own sisters or daughters. The legal system simply ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? The cycle continues, a life without perspective. Formal education never existed for the current Whittaker siblings. Freddie, Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray never attended school. They don't know how to do basic math, write, or read. Their only source of knowledge about the world comes from conversations with equally ignorant and isolated relatives. For them, their condition is normal because it is the only reality they know. The most tragic aspect is that the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limitations, has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One of these relationships resulted in the birth of a child who died at 3 months of age due to severe heart malformations. The second resulted in a miscarriage in the 5th month of gestation. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches levels like those observed in the Whittaker family, the likelihood of severe birth defects and miscarriages exceeds 50%. It is statistically more likely that a child is born with severe problems than is born healthy, she notes. The family survives exclusively on government disability benefits, approximately $800 monthly, which barely covers their basic needs. For clothing and food, they rely on the charity of neighbors. Once a month, a local church van brings basic groceries, canned beans, old bread, rice, and non-existent milk. The nearest health unit is 45 kilometers away, and the Whitaker family has no social means of transport. Aside from sitting on the porch and watching the few cars pass by on the dirt road, they know no forms of entertainment. Their existence is silent and without dark expectations or perspective. Institutional negligence and the human zoo. My first reaction was pure shock, Leiter admits in an interview. But then, it came down to a family in such extreme conditions having remained completely invisible to the authorities for so long. The road leading to the property is literally a dirt path created by the wear of decades of use by a single family. When he finally reached the house, he thought he was looking at a horror movie scene, the photographer says. He initially struggled to understand that he was looking at humans. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was some kind of haunted doll or sculpture. When he moved and made those sounds, that's when I realized I was facing something I never imagined could exist. Leiter tried to establish basic communication, but he quickly realized the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one who could form recognizable words, but even his answers were limited to some loose words, no, and yes. I asked how old he was, and he answered, a lot. I asked where he was born, and he pointed to the ground. The answer reveals deep systemic failures in American society. Raleigh County, where the Whitaker family resides, is one of Western Virginia's most neglected and poorest regions. With a population of only 78,000 inhabitants spread over a 600 kilometers area, social services are overloaded and scarce. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through access to information litigation, reveal that local authorities were aware of the Whitaker family's situation for decades but consciously chose to ignore it. It was not ignorance. It was a conscious political decision to treat the Whitaker family as a problem that simply did not exist, the documents reveal. At least 8 social worker reports between 1985 and 2005 described subhuman conditions on the Whitaker property. Each report recommended immediate intervention, and each report was filed without action by supervisors who considered the case intractable and without resolution. Morrison, a social worker who worked in the region for 15 years, explains, there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains living in precarious conditions. The resources are limited, and cases like the Whitaker family require a type of expert intervention that is simply not available in poor rural counties. The educational system also completely failed the family. Western Virginia Education Department records show that during the 1980s, school frequency control agents tried to force the children to attend school. All attempts were frustrated by the family's resistance and by the physical and mental condition of the children, unable to communicate properly, smelling strongly, and with severe disabilities. The other children were scared, and the teachers had no training to deal with such severe disabilities. Negligence wasn't just educational. Local newspaper reports from the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 1995 and 2003 document at least 2 Department of Social Services investigations into improper living conditions on the Whitaker property. Both investigations resulted in reports that were filed without any concrete action. The 1995 report described subhuman living conditions, evidence of medical neglect, absence of basic sanitation, and possible sexual abuse. The Whitaker case exposes the hypocrisy of a society that prides itself on family values yet completely abandons families that don't fit into normative standards. The local community itself has developed an ambiguous relationship with the Whitaker family. Some neighbors show genuine compassion, occasionally bringing clothes and food. Others view them as a local shame that should be hidden from external visitors, attributing the family's condition to ancestral sins or a divine curse. If this family is like this, it is because God has a purpose that is not ours to understand. This fatalist resignation permeated any attempt at external intervention for decades. The Whitaker family was not only forgotten by the system, it was actively ignored by a community that preferred to treat it as an invisible problem. A warning and a mirror. The history of the Whitaker family transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It is a profound reflection on the failures of health and education systems, institutional negligence, American rural poverty, and the systematic abandonment of marginalized populations. Subsequent genetic studies revealed that the Whittaker family is not an isolated case in the Appalachian region. What makes the Whittaker case unique is not the consanguinity itself, but the extreme temporal duration and the complete absence of external intervention, Bamshad explains. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. But the media attention also transformed the Whittaker family into a kind of human zoo attraction. Many tourists began appearing on the property, taking videos and pictures as if they were animals on display. This additional exploitation raised complex ethical questions about human dignity and consent regarding the intimate aspects of their lives. Media attention did bring some practical improvements. Spectator donations have allowed for minor reforms in the house, a functional bathroom, installation of a generator for basic electricity, and more regular access to medical care. Lorraine, 65, is now developing progressive respiratory problems. They are literally the last of their species, a family that has reproduced to extinction. But the Whittaker story also serves as a warning. In America's poorest rural regions, thousands of families live in conditions of extreme social, medical, and educational vulnerability. Geographic isolation combined with institutional negligence and poverty creates conditions where similar tragedies can silently develop. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes that the Whittaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends that affect thousands of families in the region. Cultural isolation, multidimensional poverty, and government abandonment create ecosystems where human tragedies like this can be perpetuated for generations. Williams documented at least 47 other families in the Appalachian region with significant histories of consanguinity, although none reached the extreme levels of the Whittaker family. What we see is a vulnerability gradient, she explains. The Whittaker family represents the most extreme point of a spectrum of social neglect that affects the entire region. The parallels are disturbing. Families such as the Fugates, known as blue skin caused by consanguinity, or the Hartwells, whose limbs suffer from hereditary cognitive disabilities and dwarfism, show that the Whittakers are not an isolated case. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional standard of inbreeding and isolation. Research driven by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals that consanguinity rates in isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads this initiative, states, "We are dealing with a public health crisis that has been ignored for decades." The Whittaker family represents the most severe endpoint of what happens when economic desperation combines with geographic isolation and social abandonment. The true lesson of the Whittaker family is not in their deformed genetics but in what their existence reveals about the deep failures of a society that refuses to take care of its most vulnerable members. They are an uncomfortable mirror reflecting not only physical deformities but also the social and moral deformities of a system that abandons those who most need protection. Dr. Bennett offers a dark final perspective. From a purely scientific point of view, the Whittaker family represents what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive until reproductive age. What kept this family alive was not their genes. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Every day in the life of the Whittaker siblings is a struggle against limitations that no human being should face. Their existence is simultaneously a devastating accusation against a society that allows such suffering to be perpetuated and a testimony of human resilience. Today, as you comfortably watch this story at home with access to opportunities, health, and education, the Whittaker siblings remain in their home without a future, no hope, and no electricity. They are ghosts of an America that we prefer to pretend does not exist but continues to be hidden in the forgotten folds of a country proud of its opportunities for everyone. The Whittaker family will die in silence, just as it lived. But its history will remain as a permanent testimony about what happens when a society decides that some lives simply do not matter enough to be saved. They are the genetic cost of social abandonment, the human price of institutionalized neglect, and the living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable if we only care enough to prevent them. Their lives are a question directed straight to our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the Whittaker family's existence say about who we really are? If you haven't registered yet, subscribe now because stories like this reveal truths that few have the courage to tell. If you watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here so that I can get to know you and know who truly follows the channel." Leave your like if this story impacted you in any way. Share this video so that more people understand realities that our society prefers to ignore.